My goal here is to argue that as we look to the next 2 to 3 decades of American conservatism, the category of the Christian college or university offers to us a significant and I think unique opportunity for a decisive point in the cultural battle. In order to make this argument, let me first begin with a definition of what I mean by that term decisive point. This is a military concept that can be identified by the intersection of what is both strategic and what is feasible. An action that is strategic, it's strategic when it produces large results. For instance, what if your goal was to become the most popular cellular provider for New York City, population 8 million, versus that same goal for perhaps Bowville, Idaho. It's a lovely logging community not far from where I live with a booming population of 202. As lovely as Bowville might be, New York City would be a far more strategic target than Bowville, Idaho because of its massive size. And that's what it means to be strategic. But an action is feasible when it's realistically possible. So between New York City and Bowville, Idaho, the Big Apple might be far more strategic, but Bowville is far more feasible because capturing the market in Bowville would be much easier. And that's normally the case if you think about it. The most strategic actions are also usually your least feasible and vice versa. So a good tactician then searches endlessly for those possibilities that offer the greatest potential intersection between what is strategic and what is feasible. When you find that rare moment when a possible action is both strategic and feasible, a point as easy to take as Bowville and yet as impactful as New York City, then you've identified a decisive point, the point at which you ought to just push all of your chips to the center of the table and say, I'm all in. Now, having given my definition of a decisive point, let me repeat my opening thesis. I want to argue that as we look to the future of of American conservatism, the category of Christian colleges and universities offers to us a significant decisive point in the cultural battle, a target that is both strategic and feasible. So let me restate that. In the fight to recover and reestablish the substantive conservative presence in America, the private Christian college offers to us a focal point for our energy that ought to be preferred before other options because it offers a decisive point. To make this case, let me first argue that the Christian college is feasible. I'll give you 2 reasons while reserving the right to say there's far more, but my allotted time here is brief. First, Christian colleges, by virtue of their explicit faith commitment, are established on a statement of religious faith which allows them to give the clearest articulation of the true foundations of America's conservatism, which is the Christian faith. While conservative secular colleges can only argue for a tolerant libertarianism and can only gesture vaguely toward a transcendent power, it's our Christian colleges that can point unashamedly to the triune God of the Bible, who is the creator of the universe and is the one who gave us transcendent and objective standards, the kind of standards that do not give a rip about who feels triggered by them. And this clarity at their foundation then allows Christian colleges to provide the most complete and coherent articulation of that conservative vision. And second, by virtue of being private colleges rather than state universities, I want to argue that the governance structure of these private colleges, being slightly more independent, is more straightforward and therefore offers a much more direct path to total institutional control, more than other educational institutions. When you consider the governance structure of larger secular institutions, what you discover is that because of all the different layers of governmental oversight, which include state governors, state legislatures, state departments of education, along with the federal Department of Education apparatus, and then all the individual college boards, presidents, as well as the deep state that is lying within each particular university's own administration. And what you discover is that these institutions are the inhabitants of an elusive bureaucratic swamp, and that isolating the actual levers of power in order to enact real change in one of these institutions proves either impossible or produces such a meager yield that, as they say, the juice is not worth the squeeze. I remember sitting in on a lecture on the Holy Roman Empire at the University of Oxford, and the professor explained to us that part of the brilliance of the Holy Roman Empire was that its power structure was so complicated, you could never really figure out where the actual power was located. He argued that this was what made it so difficult to topple. When you can't find the power, you can't overthrow it. And this is, I think, quite literally the case with most of our institutions of higher education. The power that is fighting against you is so diffused throughout an impossible to diagram bureaucratic structure And this is why I think we need to identify then and focus on the institutions where the power structure can be more clearly and plainly identified and then can be completely owned. I think that conservatives, are far too naive on this question. We regularly celebrate when we hear of the appointment of a prominent conservative lecturer or the creation of a conservative honors program, but we do not understand the malignant academic deep state which lurks in the shadows waiting to undermine and subvert any conservative presence. Within 3 to 5 years, these conservative projects are regularly completely subverted. However, the governance structure of smaller private colleges offer potential paths to total institutional control, which, while still admittedly difficult to achieve, I'm not making that into a small thing, they're still clearer and more possible to capture and to defend than most other educational institutional structures. With smaller private Christian colleges, you can identify and isolate the actual levers of power much more readily. Institutional control can be achieved once you have a board and a president united around a clear common mission and committed to aggressive action to achieve that mission. That's where the true decision-making power actually resides, assuming that they have the courage and the conviction to use it. There are also always other contenders for institutional control, but they compete with the board and the president only to the extent that the board and the president capitulate and abdicate their authority. But the bar must be set high when it comes to establishing what constitutes a unified governance. And this is where a Christian college with a robust statement of faith offers a clear, objective standard for establishing deep alignment. Establishing this unity of vision between the board and the president is by no means an easy thing to achieve, but this objective is relatively feasible. I would add that establishing paths of aligned funding is fairly critical as well, though still secondary to this first objective of unity of governance. So, say that what I'm suggesting actually proved to be feasible. Say we either built or captured 1 to 2 dozen first-rate Christian colleges. That's all well and good, but the one quality that most feasible targets share is that they are unstrategic. That is, they lack larger cultural relevance. With these hypothetical Christian colleges that we have taken, we're likely talking about 20 to 30,000 college students out of a total of just under 20 million students nationwide. Have we merely captured the University of Beauville 20 times over with something like that? And if so, what good does that do us? In order to qualify as a decisive point, the Christian college must be the rare target that combines feasibility with being strategic. How could these colleges be strategic? How can they exercise that disproportionate impact? First, I would argue that as we return to a merit-based economy, a private Christian college unshackled to DEI or other toxic institutional ideologies and committed to the idea of a transcendent objective standard of truth can become academically competitive more swiftly than most other institutions. While the Ivies have been making signals of repentance in order to have their federal funding restored, I think you'd have to be incredibly naive to think that the intellectual formation that they're offering their students has or will change in any substantive way in the very near future. But I know from my current experience at New St. Andrews College that a robust Christian liberal arts education creates a finished product that may have at one time been ordinary, but in our present age is consistently extraordinary. And to the extent that we can find a level playing field, we want to be able to compete. On the one hand, 20 to 30,000 students is a drop in the bucket. But on the other hand, I think we ought to imagine for a moment the impact to the conservative cause if we had a constant, consistent drip of graduates from colleges like what I'm proposing, a steady stream of tens of thousands of graduates who have a basic mastery of the intellectual skills inculcated by the liberal arts, a faithful moral formation, a commitment to building Christendom, and a track record for showing up to work sober and not planning on either embezzling or filing a lawsuit against their boss today. It's a sad fact that this description sounds like a fantasy to most employers. They would give anything to have a personnel pipeline like this. It's a description of America that we once had and could build again. I can see that this would still be a small percentage of the nation's college students, but the point is not to try to take over a majority of American colleges. The point is simply to establish a dominant model that will drive emulation in other educational institutions. I take the story of classical Christian education as a good example of this kind of force, of having one small institution act and create something unique that others then want to emulate, and you have a disproportionate impact on the larger movement for that. Classical Christian education took off in the early 1990s with the publishing of the book Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning by Douglas Wilson, and with the formation of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. From the 1990s through the first decade of the 2000s, these schools began popping up all over America and gained notoriety as the premier Christian educational option. But around the year 2010, I remember seeing that something very interesting started to happen. The term classical became a brand that everyone wanted to copy. It became untethered to just this small network of schools, and it starts to be copied everywhere. American colleges all over started all wanting to claim that they were the true centers of classical education. They created honors programs to recruit graduates of classical schools. K-12 charter schools began launching across the U.S., all claiming that classical brand. Basically, one small cluster of schools, the original classical Christian school movement, by demonstrating a new standard of excellence, established a nationwide movement that is still reshaping our K-12 schools. A dominant model drove emulation across the market. That's that strategic kind of action. A handful of Christian colleges, then, I want to argue, executing their mission with excellence would stand out so drastically against the current backdrop of American higher education that they would very quickly become a competitive force that must be either bested or copied. You'd have to either be better than them or you're going to have to copy them. And either way, I think conservative American higher education would be catapulted forward. And this would go throughout not just these private schools, but through the secular institutions, as they're going to have to either best or copy. In order for my proposal to come to fruition, evangelical Christians would need to lose their allergic reaction to institution building and institutional leadership. For several reasons that are beyond the scope of this talk, American evangelicalism has viewed institutions with great suspicion and has virtually assumed that the future of every Christian institution is apostasy. And because of this, the strategy that I'm proposing will be inimical to the evangelical world unless they're able to reject this self-fulfilling prophecy that all institutions inevitably spiral downward into apostasy. But my argument is not that other strategies could not produce results. There are plenty of one-off situations that don't fit my description, but are nevertheless very worthy ventures into conservative higher education. But the decisive point argument, I'm framing it as that decisive point, takes a step back and looks at the broad field of higher education and asks, where can we get the most bang for our buck as we invest time and money into this field? I believe that for establishing a clear conservative vision in the world of higher education, our Christian colleges offer the fulcrum with the greatest possible leverage for cultural change. Thank you.